It was perfectly acceptable to drink, eat, gamble and smoke during performances. As there were no public toilets, nobody bothered to leave the theatre if they were caught short. If the audience didn't like the show, they made their feelings obvious. The wild, anarchic scene in the southern suburbs was deeply troubling to the sober citizens on the other side of the Thames. And no one disapproved more of Southwark and all it stood for than the Puritans. They were extreme Protestants, some might say killjoys. Their preachers harangued the public about the evils of drink, sport, dancing, and above all, theatres.
The stage, with its cross-dressing, with its lasciviousness, with its romantic plots and outlandishness, the plays were a million miles away from anything that the Puritans could approve of. But they did bundle the plays in with all kinds of other things they disapproved of. I mean, women's dress in general, women's ways in general. They were pretty damn opposed to anything that you might like to do to enjoy yourself.
The Puritans, led by Oliver Cromwell, were also opponents of the king and supporters of a bigger role for Parliament. As relations between the two sides deteriorated, the authorities were worried that the theatres could become a hotbed of social unrest.
The concern of the Puritans regarding political intrigue via the theatres became so strong that by the time we get to the English Civil War, 1642, Cromwell shuts every single theatre in England. He knew they were dangerous, and the vast majority of England did not want a civil war. And if you had actors telling them that that was the case, you could force the idea further. So he shut them, and they stayed shut for 18 years. Not a single theatre remained open.
The tavern scene of South London had produced some of the greatest literature ever written. In the space of just 5 years, William Shakespeare alone had premiered 6 of his most famous plays. But the turmoil of the English Civil War of the 1640s brought this vibrant creative culture to an abrupt end. London was plunged into an era of savage religious fundamentalism and passionate political debate between supporters of the king versus Parliament. A battle which culminated in the triumph of the Puritans and the bloody demise of the king. For 11 years, Britain was a republic headed by Oliver Cromwell. Under his rule, London was a very dreary place. Southwark's empty theatres were destroyed, Sunday sports banned, the celebration of Christmas abolished. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, Londoners looked forward to a return to the good times. They had high hopes that under the merry monarch, they would enjoy a period of peace and prosperity. 20 years had passed since the turmoil of the Civil War. It was 300 years since the ravages of the Black Death. But in the space of 2 years, London would be hit once again by disaster. First by disease, then by a cataclysm that would alter the shape of the city forever. We have a unique record of London before and after its transformation, thanks to a little-known engraver, Wenceslas Holler. Much of what we know about the London we have lost we owe to him. Holler arrived in London in 1637, a refugee from Bohemia, the modern Czech Republic. From the top of a bell tower on the south bank of the river in Southwark, Holler set about recording his new home in minute detail. On the river, he saw hundreds of ships carrying goods to and from Europe. To the east, the medieval London Bridge, crammed with shops and houses. Holler didn't realize as he drew the ancient, overcrowded city that he was mapping the cause of London's imminent devastation by disease and fire. His sketches were source material for his great masterpiece, a massive 8-foot panorama of London called The Long View. In the foreground of the long view, we see leafy Southwark, with the bishop's residence cheek by jowl with taverns, brothels and workshops. Across the river is the densely populated city of London, backed by open countryside. To the east, the Thames stretches as far as the eye can see.
What is so good about this view, really, is the fact that it shows all the city together with such fidelity to detail, which is just incredible. We have nothing else like it. It's quite idiosyncratic in many ways, and one of the unusual things you'll notice are the spellings of some of the names, like St. Paul's Church, and the spelling here we have a bit of beer baiting rather than the bear baiting, because English wasn't Holler's first language. But there's something about the wonderful draftsman that he was, and in his eye for detail. You know, the houses, the small figures that are walking through the streets, the gardens. It's just this amazing record.
To modern eyes, 17th century London looks rather charming. But the vast scale of Holler's print disguises the fact that much of the city was falling apart.
London was well and truly run down. Compared with Paris, which was being rebuilt as a great, grand city, compared with Italy with its classical buildings, London's buildings had been allowed to deteriorate, first in the Civil War, then during the Commonwealth. Troops had been stationed inside St. Paul's, horses billeted inside old St. Paul's, and because it was struck by lightning in 1564, it had a tumble-down spire. So it was a mess.
Holler's engravings of St. Paul's are one of the few records we have of the old medieval structure. His detailed drawings took years to complete, and Holler was often short of money. Desperate for a commission, in 1660 he wrote to the new King Charles II, proposing a vast-scale map of London.
The map is to contain 10 foot in breadth and 5 foot upward. Therein shall be expressed not only the streets, lanes, alleys, etc., proportionately measured, but also the buildings, as much resembling the likeness of them as the convenience of the room will permit.
This is a sample of Holler's map which he made to show the king what the final work would look like. It offers a unique glimpse into the lives of Londoners of the period. The rich parade through the fashionable district of Covent Garden. In the vast green expanses of St. Giles's Fields, labourers plough furrows. There are even merrymakers dancing around a maypole, marking the reintroduction of May Day celebrations, banned during the Civil War. But the king couldn't afford to fund such a huge project, to Holler's bitter disappointment. Little did the artist realize that the densely populated city was about to disappear. In 1665, London was revisited by its worst nightmare: plague. The disease spread like wildfire through the filthy, overcrowded streets. Records show that this outbreak was the worst epidemic since the Black Death 300 years earlier. It began slowly in May, killing 31 people in St. Giles, one of the poorest districts. In July, it gathered momentum, killing over 1,000 a week. By August, the death toll was over 2,000 Londoners a week. In September, it peaked at over 7,000. By winter, the plague had wiped out 100,000 people, 1/5 of the city's entire population. Two of the victims were Holler's 22-year-old son, James, and his print publisher. His business was badly hit during the plague year, as rich patrons deserted the disease-ridden city in droves. And the worst was not yet over. The next year was 1666, a date which filled Londoners with foreboding.
late 17th century London was a very superstitious place, and in a sense people looked at these disasters in a very sort of pragmatic way. They saw them as a punishment. This was a punishment from God for wickedness.
Doom-mongers stood on every street corner issuing dire warnings of impending disaster. The Quaker Solomon Eagle walked naked through the streets of London, carrying an urn of flaming fire.
Oh, London, London, sinful as Sodom and Gomorrah, the decree is gone out. Repent or burn.
In the autumn, it seemed that all these dreadful prophecies were fulfilled. London reaped the whirlwind. In the early hours of Sunday, September the 2nd, a fire broke out in the King's Bakery in Pudding Lane, in the heart of the medieval city. Small fires like this were common, and at first the locals weren't too worried. When the Mayor of London visited the scene, he remarked, a woman could piss it out. How wrong he was.
1666 was a hot year, very dry, not much rain. The actual day of the fire, there was a wind blowing, and of course that was the disaster, a hot, warm wind that was blowing the fire westwards. And there was no way that anyone was going to put it out.
Londoners had never experienced a disaster on this scale before. Within 24 hours, the fire was raging out of control, leaping from street to street, greedily consuming the close-knit timber and pitch houses. As night fell on September the 2nd, the heart of the old city was ablaze. People who'd thought they were safe now fled. The Navy official Samuel Pepys recorded in his diary Londoners' pathetic attempts to save their property.
Everybody endeavouring to remove their goods and flinging them into the river. Poor people staying in their houses till the very fire touched them and then running into the boats. And among them, the poor pigeons were loath to leave their houses, but hovered about the windows and balconies till some of them burned their wings and fell down.
By Monday, the 3rd of September, the flames were destroying 100 properties an hour. The God-fearing saw the fire as an expression of divine anger with a sinful and pleasure-loving city. As the Puritan Thomas Vincent put it,
now the fire gets mastery and burns dreadfully, and God, with his great bellows, blows upon it, which makes it spread quickly and go on with such force and rage, overturning all so furiously that the whole city is brought into jeopardy of desolation.
The third day of the fire was the worst. Businessmen desperately tried to save stock by moving it to where they thought it would be safe. The city's booksellers and stationers piled the crypts of churches with paper, thereby creating a tinderbox. When London's principal church, St. Paul's Cathedral, caught fire, hundreds of books, including 300 copies of Holler's History of St. Paul's, went up in flames. In total, books worth £150 million in today's money were destroyed. Holler's personal losses were huge. There was horror and devastation all around him. But he realized that he was witnessing a defining moment in the history of the city he knew so well. Like a photojournalist, he set to work recording the death of medieval London. With his forensic eye for detail, Holler sketched the fire's terrible path across the city. By Wednesday morning, the wind had dropped, and the fire had lost its intensity. 36 hours later, the final flames were extinguished. Holler's beloved London was now a sea of rubble, dotted with blackened ruins. The familiar view from the South Bank was now unrecognizable. In 4 days, 87 churches, 13,000 houses, and many major buildings had been destroyed. 100,000 people had been made homeless. As they surveyed the scene of utter devastation, Londoners tried to come to terms with their losses and almost immediately began clamoring for compensation.
thousands of properties were destroyed, and each piece of property had an owner and sometimes multiple owners, and some of them were shops, and some of them were domestic residences, and some of them were commercial operations with many partners and shareholders. Every one of those, it was decided, would get their interest back, and every one of them stood hawk-eyed, checking that each of them gets back exactly what they had and that their neighbour doesn't encroach on a little bit of their yard.
Holler's lifelike renderings of the fire made him an invaluable source of information for the king and the city authorities as they tried to sort out a mass of property disputes and claims. And so in the wake of the fire, Holler finally got his major commission. The city officials instructed him to make
an exact survey of the city as it now stands after the calamity of the late fire.
Holler's maps were executed with all his usual precision. They stand as the definitive record of the Great Fire of London and a sobering reminder of just how total the devastation had been. The white spaces represent the areas where once buildings had stood. But even this map could not make Holler a rich man. One contemporary wrote,
The sickness time and the fire of London happening the year after so stagnated all affairs of prince and books and reduced him to such difficulties as he could never overcome.
Holler died in poverty in 1677 at the age of 69. But his contribution to the history of London is immeasurable. Wenceslas Holler was on the cusp of the old world and the new. 436 acres of the medieval city he'd so lovingly mapped had gone. But the fire was an opportunity to create a grand, planned city with better amenities for its citizens. Modern London would rise from the ashes and become the biggest city in the world. The capital of a great empire whose power and influence would radiate across the globe.
Thanks.
Not supposed to win. Excuse me.
All right,
Excuse me.
Oh, thanks. You'd always the same, you, when you've had one of your big nights out.
Abby's new reward mortgage gives you 1% of your mortgage back in cash every 2 years. On the dot, no catches. If you fancy a mortgage that rewards loyalty, pop in for a chat.
Bacteria! Oh, take your advice.
That's bacteria management. Topping up your good bacteria with Yakult's friendly bacteria. It's small, but it's effective.
Hang on. If I were you, I'd get some friendly bacteria. I told them.
Vega engine technology. Better pictures, whatever you're watching.
Churchill, I see you couldn't save any of those penalties, direct or indirect free kicks.
Obviously not.
Nor could you save us from alien invasion.
No.
But you could save us money on our car insurance.
Oh, yes.
Yes, Churchill could save you up to 30% on car insurance. Call him now on 0800 917 7621 or visit him at churchill.com.
Go home.
No.
Old Chinese proverbs say, cow in field, not always what it seems. For a cow will always seek to get dairily goodness into children. So now, may bestow upon us new tribites, the non-squishy dairily. Wax-sealed and most chompable. Cows, do not underestimate them. New tribites, dairily goodness, but not soft.
Incredibly, 1 million of us can have diabetes and not even know it. Symptoms like needing the loo more often or just feeling tired are easy to miss. But spot diabetes early enough and it's easier for your doctor to treat. That's why Lloyd's Pharmacy offers free diabetes tests. Thank you. To everyone. Lloyd's Pharmacy, your local health authority.
What will you find when you enter the abyss?
What do you think he saw?
The Abyss, Saturday at 9 on 4.
The Great Fire of London of September 1666 had ripped through the city. 436 acres of medieval London had been razed to the ground. How would the city recover from this near mortal blow?
The fire of London was a calamity. I mean, you can't regard as anything but a calamity a conflagration that destroys the entire heart of a major city, even if it was run down. But it was a void which could be filled with promise, it could be filled with opportunity. Anything could be put back into that heart of London.
As it turned out, a new London would rise from the ashes, but not quite as the planners had hoped. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, the first concern was the 100,000 people who had been made homeless, about 25% of the city's population. Many of them were living in makeshift camps in the rubble or in fields outside the city. The king, Charles II, only recently restored to the throne, had taken personal charge during the fire. He appeared in public to reassure Londoners that every effort would be made to rehouse them. But an even greater priority was London itself.
The whole prosperity of England relied on the prosperity of the city, on its effectiveness as a trading place. And everyone's concern after the fire, the overriding concern was getting London up and trading again.
Charles was torn. On the one hand, he needed the money generated by the city. On the other hand, he harbored ambitions to reside in a capital fit for a king. He had spent his youth as an exile in Europe, a penniless guest in the splendid capitals of his continental relations.
Charles II had been in Paris. He had moved from centre to centre of grand architectural design. For him, above all, London was a degenerate city when he returned, and he was deeply distressed at what he encountered. He wasn't going to live in a city like the London that he inherited.
Now the dilapidated medieval city had gone, Charles had a chance to create a magnificent, planned city that would befit London's status as the capital of a great trading nation. Within days of the fire, 5 candidates came up with plans for a brand new London and rushed them to the king. The scientist, Robert Hooke, proposed a modern grid layout. Richard Newcourt wanted to rebuild each parish as a single block. Valentine Knight ringed the city with canals, and the courtier John Evelyn designed a series of elegant boulevards. But the most ambitious design came from the king's childhood companion, the astronomer and architect, Christopher Wren. This is a glimpse of what London would have looked like under Wren's plan. he shared Charles's vision of a European-style capital with grand piazzas, long straight avenues, and magnificent vistas. But the pressure on Charles and the city authorities to make a decision quickly was intense. Trade was suffering, and people were desperate to rebuild their homes and businesses.
London was at heart a city about private enterprise and free trade, and it was very, very difficult for the state or for the city to buy out all those people who owned the little plots of land. And that's what had to happen if they were going to replan the city. If they were going to make the streets wider, they were going to make squares and boulevards and vistas, they had to buy land from the individual landowners, and there wasn't the time or the money or, quite frankly, the inclination to do it.
All the grand plans were rejected. Individual landowners would be allowed to rebuild their own houses. The old medieval street plan would be retained. But Charles was determined Londoners would not simply recreate a tinderbox of narrow alleys and wooden houses. So he asked his favourite, Christopher Wren, and the scientist Robert Hooke to oversee the rebuilding of the city. They ordered the main thoroughfares, like Fleet Street, to be widened to make it impossible for a fire to leap from one side to the other. And they laid down strict rules that all new houses had to be made of stone, brick, and tile.
British buildings from then on were structurally sound buildings. All right, they were spec building, but the buildings that we still have today built around Wren and Hooke, who were interested in brick quality, who were interested in how deep foundations had to be laid, the structural qualities of earth against masonry. All of that was modern, and the building of the City of London was modern, and the city ultimately was a modern city.
In 1677, the monument to the Great Fire of London was unveiled. A huge pillar, 202 feet high, topped by a flaming urn. Just a stone's throw from the site where the Great Fire started, it served both as a reminder of the calamity and a symbol of the birth of the new London from the ashes of the old. Wren failed in his dream to redesign London completely, but there was a consolation prize. He was commissioned to rebuild the city's parish churches, which had been destroyed in the fire. A task which would enshrine him as the man who created the skyline of modern London.
And Sir Christopher Wren rose to the challenge and has left an indelible mark on the skyline of London that really stayed there until the Blitz and the Second World War. And all his churches were so richly different. He gathered around him a talented group of young architects who knew the architecture of Europe, and they fed that into Wren as their great leader. Tiny churches, big churches, spires, great, small, large, and all different. And alongside that, for the first time, he was given the opportunity to build churches for the Church of England.
The focus of Wren's rebuilding work was London's most important church, St. Paul's Cathedral, badly damaged in the fire.
Of all the monuments that were lost, the greatest loss must have been St. Paul's Cathedral. It was always the great symbol of London. It was always a symbol of London's economic virility, actually. It had had a tremendous spire on it, which had come off in the Elizabethan period, but it was still the largest cathedral in England by a very long way. And there was a big question. What do? We have to have a cathedral. We have to have a big building in the centre of the city.
Christopher Wren was asked to design a new cathedral. Even before the fire, he had set his heart on building the first European-style Renaissance dome in England, and made this plan of how it would look. But he had to please three different clients. The king, who shared Wren's desire for a modern European church, the Church of England, who couldn't bear anything which reeked of Roman Catholicism, and the conservative souls of the Corporation of London, who simply wanted a huge status symbol, ideally with a spire.
The designs that Wren drew consistently fudged between spire and dome. But the piers that he put in the foundations of St. Paul's were always the piers for a dome. Whatever the corporation thought, Wren was always going to build a dome.
Wren always said he wanted to build for eternity. Over 7 years, he doggedly produced a series of designs. To sell his favorite, he spent a year building an 18-foot scale model. It was rejected by the clergy as too foreign. Finally, in 1675, Wren came up with a compromise acceptable to all parties. He put a spire on top of the dome, and the foundation stone was laid. St. Paul's took 35 years to finish, but Wren lived to see his masterwork completed. Over the south door he carved a phoenix rising from the flames, and the motto, Resurgam, meaning, I shall rise again.
This extraordinary dome standing high above London, 850 tons worth of masonry on top of it, a cross on top of that so that it can be seen from Epsom. It is a feat to take your breath away in 1711. It was a radical cathedral, the first Anglican cathedral.
Thanks to the fire and the pioneering work of Christopher Wren and his colleagues, modern London had been born. Wren's skyline, his 51 churches dominated by the massive dome of St. Paul's, would survive for over 200 years, until the arrival of Hitler's bombers.
I was helping out the other day, as usual. Then suddenly an idea hit me. Put us puppies on the paper.
Now there's a new type of Andrex, with puppies on the roll.
It's inspired.
Andrex, looking out for the family. Benecol yogurt drink. Just 1 pot a day is enough to lower your cholesterol. Benecol, proven to reduce cholesterol.
Impossible to shift tough baked-on greasy stains without soaking. Not with new Finish 3-in-1 Brilliant. It has the total grease-cutting power to blast away the toughest baked-on stains. Its unique Powerball technology gives unbeatable shine. Finish. Brilliant results first time, every time.
What if, instead of using a bag, you carried all your shopping in your arms? What if you decided to cross a river without using the bridge? And what if you spent hours trawling countless travel sites instead of visiting a website where you could create your perfect trip in moments? You'd have to be crazy, wouldn't you? Stop searching, start creating.
From your late 20s, the early signs of aging appear. Now you can fight them from the start. New Nivea Visage Beauty Boost with creatine, a coenzyme that works together with your skin, boosting its ability to fight time. The result? Visibly fewer wrinkles, finer pores, firmer skin, and a velvety soft feeling. Proven. New Beauty Boost from Nivea Visage. Face care inspired by the way your skin works.
Great protection needn't mean a sticky situation. Garnier Ombre Solaire's non-sticky formula with a unique filter protects your skin against UVA and UVB rays. It's moisturizing and water resistant too. So relax, no one makes the sun safer. Garnier Ombre Solaire with new spill-proof cap.
Garnier.
Just 50 years after the Great Fire, at the beginning of the 18th century, London had once again expanded dramatically to become the largest city in Europe. The geography of the city also changed physically and socially. The super-rich now lived in the west, the downtrodden poor in the east. London's underclass spiraled into a terrible addiction to gin, provoking a moral panic about the overgrown, corrupt city.
In the medieval city, the rich and poor lived cheek by jowl. They took it for granted that all the classes would be mixed together. But after the fire, which swept away all of medieval London, the rich saw this as an opportunity to start anew. So they migrated west, leaving the poor in the city, and they tended to migrate towards the east. So we started up this polarity that still exists in London today between the rich in the west and the poor in the east.
The pioneer in the creation of the affluent West End of London was Nicholas Barbon. The son of a Puritan preacher, Barbon had been to university in Holland, where he picked up new ideas on finance and money-making. He represented a new breed of aggressively entrepreneurial Londoner.
He was a money man, a financial man, a chancer, a risk taker. At a time in the late 17th century when London was growing beyond imagination into the kind of city that no one had seen before, and he thought about how people could make money out of rebuilding London.
In the 1680s and 90s, Barbon bought up plots of land in the west of London, greenfield sites where he built rows of neat, flat-fronted houses in straight streets with open squares. In a drive to cut building costs, Barbon pioneered a brand new housing design, the terrace, rows of separate homes which looked like one grand building. Terraces were unique to London and perfectly suited the aspirations of the capital's upwardly mobile new rich, who flocked to these desirable addresses. By the 1720s, the West End was a playground for those with money to burn. A vast pleasure palace filled with endless diversions, glittering ballrooms, theatres, clubs, and gaming tables.
The largest growing class in London in the 18th century was the merchant class. These were people who had made a lot of money from trade in colonial goods, but they didn't have any class, they didn't have any pedigree. The aristocratic class looked down on them. So what did they do? They bought themselves into aristocratic values. They built grand houses. They had great banquets. They drove elaborate and gilded coaches. They had fantastic and lavish parties. In other words, consumption was conspicuous.
The City of London in the east was still the financial district. Here, business was done in coffee houses, where the all-male patrons indulged in fashionable stimulants: coffee, tea, and tobacco. In the early 18th century, Britain was expanding to become a global power, dominating the world of finance and trade in colonial goods.
British ships are starting to go further and further across the world. And it's London that's at the heart of this. It's in London that the deals are being made to finance these expeditions. It's in London that the great merchants and financiers are putting together the structure of this. It's in London where the docks are expanding out to the east of the city.
London was a city of speculators. People won and lost fortunes on the newly formed stock market. They blew their savings on government-sponsored lotteries. They were obsessed with gambling, risk, and above all, money. The writer Daniel Defoe complained,
"The luxury of the age will be the ruin of the nation, if not prevented. We leave trade to game in stocks. We live above ourselves and barter our ready money for trifles."
London was a jungle of opportunities, and as ever, a magnet for those hoping to make a better life.
You could come to London as a servant or as a poor person, have a win at cards, get lucky with your job, make a bit of money, And the next day you'd buy yourself some fine clothes and you'd be walking down the Strand as a gentleman. And fortunes could go in the other direction as well. You could be an heir, you could inherit a huge estate, lose it all at the cards in the Covent Garden gaming clubs one day, and you'd wake up at dawn bankrupt.
For those who failed, London was unforgiving, and they ended up in the impoverished ghettos to the east. Just a few minutes' walk away from what is now the busy shopping district of the modern West End was one of the vilest slums in London, St Giles.
The houses in St Giles were not called houses, they were called rookeries, because it suggested people packed into nests, you know. It was a place of the marginalised, the destitute, it was a place of pickpockets, murders, rapes, illegal gambling, cockfighting. You know, any imaginable human depravity took place in St Giles.
The vast gulf between rich and poor fueled crime rates, and fear of crime in turn obsessed the rich. Newspapers, another new phenomenon, were passed round coffee houses and regaled their readers with sensational stories about highwaymen, murderers and executions. And the focus for wealthy Londoners' anxieties about crime was St Giles. Paranoia about this wretched quarter reached fever pitch in the early 1700s, when the urban poor seized upon a terrifying new vice, gin. The gin of the 18th century bore no relation to the respectable, expensive spirit of today. A Dutch import, Madame Geneva, as she was called, was cheap and lethal.
This new drink from Holland suddenly arrived on the people who weren't used to drinking spirits. The strongest thing they'd drunk before was strong beer, and suddenly, for a penny a dram, they could get this fantastic new drug. Stronger than anything they'd tasted before, it would instantly get them drunk. There was a famous signboard that was said to be seen over gin shops saying, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence, straw for nothing." And the straw, of course, was to crash out on once the drinkers had drunk too much.
In the early 1700s, the government fueled London's gin craze by removing the restrictions on distilling. Soon, London was awash with gin shops. If you couldn't afford a glass, you could buy a gin-soaked rag. It was estimated that a quarter of the buildings in St Giles were drinking dens. Its residents were infamous for guzzling vast quantities of gin and for a few hours escaping their miserable lives.
The real villains of this debauchery and drunkenness and destruction of human life were the landowners who made tons of money by selling their corn for the purposes of gin distillation. So really there was a kind of economic stranglehold in the poor. You know, they're encouraged to consume something that will destroy their lives, a kind of a drug. It was the equivalent of crack cocaine, really.
Gin was seen to be a London problem, and in the 1720s a backlash against it began, led by Christian reformers.
London was seen as a town that was spinning out of control. There was a crime wave, and gin was seen to be associated with crime and prostitution. And so the spread of syphilis, which was the big health scare at the time, was seen to be associated with gin because women were thought to be turning to prostitution to fund their drinking habits. It was seen to be attacking the economy. At the time, the wealth of the nation was thought to depend on how much poor people could make. And if poor people, instead of working hard, were lying slumped in the door of a gin shop, then they weren't making anything.
In 1729, the government took the first step towards clamping down on this new urban drug. The first Gin Act increased the duty paid on gin from 5 pence to 5 shillings and forced gin sellers to buy licenses. But Londoners soon found a way round the rules. The law only applied to flavoured spirits, so distillers simply removed the juniper from the gin and renamed it Parliamentary Brandy.
Talk to them fine gentlemen in the Parliament.
By the 1730s, tales of gin-induced crime and depravity were again dominating the papers. One story in particular rekindled gin hysteria, the case of Judith Defoe. A poor woman, Defoe's child was cared for by the parish in a local workhouse. One Sunday, she took the infant out for the day, strangled it, and sold its clothes to buy gin. The artist, William Hogarth, was so moved by the devastation wreaked by gin that he produced his most famous engraving, set in the slum of St. Giles, Gin Lane.
One of the most powerful images of social degradation in all of 18th century art is of that woman in the foreground who's so drunk, and she's got a syphilitic leg full of syphilitic sores. She's trying to get some snuff, and as she's trying to get her snuff, her baby falls from her arms and topples and dies. It's an extraordinary image because there's an echo of a Madonna and Child picture. And of course when a baby falls, it falls as a kind of upside down crucifixion, the way its arms are spread. And the woman is a kind of a drunken Mary. So it's almost showing how Christian values have been absolutely depraved and destroyed by this addiction to gin.
Over the next 30 years, the government introduced a series of measures aimed at controlling the gin craze. First, they tried the radical step of prohibition, which simply drove gin underground. People set up illegal stills, and women sold drams from underneath their skirts. There was no let-up in gin-fueled violence. So the authorities brought in a series of acts which gradually brought distilling back within the law and slowly raised the tax on gin. But the gin craze finally fizzled out because the world was changing. In the 1750s, the economic boom came to an end. The poor couldn't afford a drink which was becoming more and more expensive. But above all, in the second half of the 18th century, there was a new mood of zealous social reform abroad in the capital.
About the 1750s, you see people writing tracts about how to improve London and expressing shock that the greatest city in the world, the city of the world's greatest power, should be full of these terrible sights of prostitution, of people drinking too much and lying drunk in the gutters. And all of that, parliamentarians, writers, reformers are saying, have got to be cleaned up.
Poverty and excess would never leave London. St. Giles remained a notorious slum into the 19th century, until it was finally knocked down to ease congestion on London streets caused by the arrival of the railways. A new era was dawning, and a revolution in transport would allow Londoners to escape the inner city for a new life in the suburbs. By 1811, London would become the first city in the Western world whose population topped 1 million. But it was still relatively compact. A person could cross the city on foot in around 2 hours. In 100 years, the physical shape of the city would be transformed by the energy and enterprise of Victorian Londoners. From being 6 miles across from east to west, Greater London would spread like a stain across the southeast of England, until by the early 20th century, it was a monster city, 18 miles wide, spanned by the first mass transport system in the world.
It was a megalopolis. It was this massively exploding city. And it happened because of technology. It happened because of railways, which attracted people. It meant that they could get there, and then it meant that they could live there and live further away from the centre.
London's transformation was driven by Britain's status at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. The first public steam railway was built by George Stephenson in 1825. 25 years later, Britain had a rail network linking the entire country. The first railway in London was built in 1836. The railway stirred the imagination of Londoners, particularly the middle classes who could afford to use them. One contemporary wrote,
The railways are so vast and important that the useless Egyptian pyramids, all the justly vaunted remnants of old Rome's magnificence, will not be able to endure comparison.
The train even changed time itself. Before the arrival of the railways, towns in Britain had their own individual time as the sun rises at different times across the country.
When the railways came, they had to standardise that, otherwise there'd have been total confusion. And it was quite natural that they chose London, Greenwich Mean Time, as the standard, because London was the capital of Britain and the capital of a colonial empire. So London became the standard time for both Britain and the world.
In the space of 40 years, the great stations, Euston, King's Cross, Paddington and St Pancras, rose up across the city, temples to progress. To build the railways, great canyons were carved out into the city. Slums offered the cheapest land to build on. The poor were ruthlessly evicted to make way for the train.
In the case of St Pancras, they overturned one of London's oldest churchyard. Dig up the dead and throw them away. It doesn't matter, we've got trains to build. And that's what was the centre of Victorian London.
Having dug up the dead to build railways, Victorians found that they were contributing to the city's chronic overcrowding. More and more people were moving to London. By the mid-1800s, the city's graveyards were overflowing. One woman complained of coming across 4 putrefying heads sticking out of the ground in a South London church. But the Victorians had a solution to the acute shortage of space for London's dead. They built a railway line purely to carry coffins out of the city. Opened in 1854, the Necropolis Railway had a mortuary station in the south of London where grieving families brought their loved ones. Coffins and mourners were then loaded onto the black-clad train and taken to the Brookwood Cemetery, 25 miles away in the countryside.
A wonderfully Victorian kind of aspect of the whole necropolis train of the dead story is that it also followed the hierarchies of the time. You could get first, second or third class tickets on the necropolis one-way train. If you were a first class passenger, I mean you're dead, but still you're first class, so you'd have mutes walking in front of the train which would travel very slowly on your last journey, and there'd be black flags waving. If you were a third class passenger, it would get to the burial grounds as quickly as possible. You'd be piled up with all the other dead paupers in the back and just dumped into an unmarked grave on the time you got there, because that's all the only ticket you'd paid for. Such a fantastic worldview.
London was still growing at an alarming rate, so the ingenious Victorians came up with another radical idea for solving London's acute congestion: building highways underground. Enter a brilliant Frenchman, Marc Brunel, who came to London in 1799. He was destined to make a major contribution to the creation of London's transport network. Brunel devised a scheme to ease the flow of traffic across the city, tunnelling under the Thames between Wapping on the north bank and Rotherhithe on the south to create a road link. To do this, he had to solve the problem of how to bore deep under the Thames.
Marc Brunel watched a wood-boring insect going about its business, and he couldn't work out why the insect didn't suffocate once it had bored the hole. As a result of this observation, he invented the tunnelling shield.
The shield was a giant iron frame which allowed 36 miners to work at once while protecting them from falling earth. Behind the miners, a team of bricklayers shored up the tunnel. Brunel's plan was hugely ambitious and dangerous. If he didn't stay on course, he would hit quicksand below or water above. At the Thames' deepest point, the tunnel would be just 14 feet below the riverbed. Tunnelling began in 1825. Marc Brunel was assisted by his equally brilliant son, Isambard Kingdom, who became resident engineer at the age of just 20. The Brunels predicted that the tunnel would take 3 years to finish, but work was painfully slow.
It was under constant danger of flood. The work had to stop several times. There were great financial problems with building it. And again, it was a kind of a tribute that it ever happened, that it was a hopeless enterprise.
As well as the flooding, the air under the Thames was foul and poisonous gases constantly leaked in. Mark Brunel's health suffered terribly, as did his workers.
May 26th. I feel much debility after having been some time below. My sight is rather dim today. All complain of pain in the eyes. May 29th. Short reported himself unable to work, afflicted like Hawkins and all the others. Boyer died yesterday. A good man.
In the end, Brunel's tunnel took 5 times longer than he'd anticipated. Londoners nicknamed it the Great Bore. The tunnel was finally completed in 1841 and was a landmark engineering achievement. But money had run out to build the approach roads into it, and the project had been a financial disaster for its investors. But the tunnel did attract hordes of visitors, 2 million in the first year. Fairs were held in it, with entertainers and stalls selling souvenirs. By the 1860s, the tunnel's novelty as a tourist attraction had worn off, and it was sold to the East London Railway for £200,000, a third of what it cost to build. The revolutionary shield was sold for scrap. Mark Brunel died in 1849. He never lived to see his vital contribution to London's transport. Today, his tunnel is part of the London Underground.
Mark Brunel's tunnelling shield paved the way for the underground system that we know today. It made deep tunnelling possible.
Brunel's idea was picked up by other engineers. Thanks to him, London was the first city in the world to solve its traffic problems by creating an underground railway. The first part of the network was a shallow tunnel linking Paddington in the west to Farringdon in the east, which was opened in 1863. Passengers travelled a distance of 3 miles underground in a steam train. Newspapers warned their readers that they would suffocate if they went on it.
I had my first experience of Hades today. The compartment in which I sat was filled with passengers who were smoking pipes. The atmosphere was a mixture of sulphur, coal dust, and foul fumes from the gas lamps above, so that by the time we reached Moorgate, I was near dead of asphyxiation and heat. I should think these underground railways must soon be discontinued, for they are a menace to health.
But despite the discomfort, the new London Underground Railway was a huge hit. People were so fascinated that they rode up and down the line all day.
Right from the beginning, this little railway was amazingly successful, and people absolutely flocked onto it. It obviously filled a great need. I mean, within a couple of years, it was making very hefty profits. 11 million people travelled it in the second year, which was 3 or 4 times the population of the whole of London.
The success of the first underground train encouraged the government to approve plans for a complete underground circuit linking the whole of London. But land suitable for shallow tunnels soon ran out, so the railway companies turned to deep hole boring, using methods based on Brunel's pioneering shield. In just 35 years, London had produced the world's first joined-up under- and overground railway network.
I think it is a tribute to the inventiveness of the Victorians that it did come so early, that by 1863 we had an underground railway. Paris wouldn't get its railway until 1900. It was an amazing feat.
By the 1900s, the tube was thrusting ever outwards, with overground lines bursting out of the earth where the city ended. Houses sprang up along the tube line. Developers lured Londoners to move out of town with the promise of an idyllic life in the leafy suburbs.
The suburbs were enormously attractive to the middle classes. The idea that the countryside, with all that had to offer, fresh air, open space, places for the children to play, was suddenly accessible to one. And that was an entirely new concept of living, a new way of life.
By the end of the 1930s, the population of Greater London had reached over 8 million, second only to New York. In just over half a century, London had increased 6 times in size and was now 34 miles across from east to west. It was still one of the largest cities in the world and was now poised on the brink of another cataclysm. The Second World War would subject London to an ordeal which threatened to bring it to its knees.
Bev!
Kev! Bev!
Kev? Bev? Kev!
Bev! Kev!
With an AA car loan, the typical APR is just 6.6%, so you might surprise yourself with what you can afford.
Nice car.
Thanks! We used to have one of those.
To get more car for your money, call the AA on 0800 374 999 or visit theaa.com. Call now and you could also get a free AA car inspection.
Impossible to shift tough baked-on greasy stains without soaking. Not with new Finish 3-in-1 Brilliant. It has the total grease-cutting power to blast away the toughest baked-on stains. Its unique Powerball technology gives unbeatable shine. Finish. Brilliant results first time, every time.
I wish I always worried a little less and eaten a little more.
When I was younger, I wish I'd drunk more beer.
And I wish I'd got more grass stains.
Girls, you are never too old.
Grass stains. You hussy.
Give him 2 Lord pack.
I'm here in Naples to see how Sainsbury's add quality to something as everyday as pasta.
Oh, Murray!
Oh, Passi! There's this family that makes Sainsbury's dry pasta. So this is durum wheat.
This is the typical Italian durum wheat for making the pasta. We grind it into flour, we mix water, and that's all that makes pasta. You know, Sainsbury's insists on the purity of the raw materials.
Beautiful. So do you guys all eat the pasta from this factory?
Of course.
Wow, look at this. What are you making?
Just oil, tomato, garlic.
And basilico.
If Sainsbury's are being this demanding about something as everyday as pasta, it's brilliant. Buonissimo. That's beautiful.
They've had it all. Slap-up meal, wine. And now I'm going to give him one long night of hellish heartburn. He's not going to get a wink of sleep. No, not New Gavilas.
New Gavilas, a small advanced tablet that helps put out the fire of hellish heartburn and indigestion for up to 12 hours.
12 hours. What am I going to do for 12 hours?
Beauty is not a question of age.
Triumph over time. New Age Perfect Double Active from L'Oreal. 1. Pure vitamin C to illuminate. 2. Elastium to decrinkle the skin. In just 1 step, dual effectiveness. Instantly skin is transformed. More radiant. Smoother. Immediately decrinkled.
And I feel 10 years younger.
Age Perfect Double Active from L'Oreal Paris.
Look younger, because you're worth it.
Don't wait to wax. Try Veet's ready-to-use wax strips for short hair, for longer lasting smoothness. Veet, a feeling that lasts.
This restaurant needs expert help.
What you're telling me is absolute.
But will they listen to Gordon's advice?
Richard's calling out orders and you're tipping cutlery upside down. I'm ready for an argument. Right now. If you want an argument, you're talking out your go outside.
Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares, Tuesday at 9 on 4.
The Second World War presented London with a huge challenge, as the Germans unleashed on the city a new form of 20th century warfare, massive aerial bombardment.
Und wenn die britische Luftwaffe 200, 300, 4.000 Kilogramm Bomben wirft, dann werfen wir jetzt in einer Nacht 150, 180, 230, 300, 400.
During the war, large parts of London would be destroyed. But as in the past, the city would rise to the challenge of renewal. When Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, Londoners braced themselves for the worst. To prepare for the anticipated air raids, the authorities raised barrage balloons across the city and installed anti-aircraft guns in public parks. There was a blackout at night and practice air raid sirens. Londoners were issued with gas masks, and over 500,000 women and children were evacuated from the city. Churchill predicted that the first week of bombing alone would involve up to 40,000 casualties, as he described London as the greatest target in the world, a tremendous, fat, valuable cow.
London in 1939 was without a slightest doubt the greatest city in the world. More traffic passed through the port of London than through any other port in the world. It was the seat of the judiciary, of the executive, of legislature, of the court. It was the prime target for any aggressor. If you could knock out London, you could knock out England. You could almost knock out Western Europe.
1939 turned out to be an anticlimax, the year of the phony war, and British civilians were untouched by the carnage on mainland Europe. But finally, on the 4th of September 1940, Hitler, incensed by British air raids on Berlin, announced a new strategy, the mass bombardment of British cities. He promised to erase them. London was his main target. 3 days later, German planes flew up the Thames towards the commercial and industrial districts in the east of the city. The Blitz had begun. The first 3 days of bombing left 1,200 people dead and London's docks in flames. This terrifying inferno was more intense than anything seen in London since 1666.
The most overwhelming impact of the Blitz on London was fire, yet again in London's history, the place ravaged by blazes that destroyed churches, public buildings, houses and whole streets, an enormous level of destruction.
Given that everyone was expecting bombs, the arrangements to protect civilians were totally inadequate. What's more, the authorities had decided that Londoners shouldn't be allowed to use the tube as a shelter. They feared that London would become a city of troglodytes who would never surface to get on with their work. However, within days of the Blitz beginning, Londoners took matters into their own hands.
People started to buy penny halfpenny tickets to take an underground train, which meant they could just go down onto the station, and there they stayed. And the government simply gave in, recognised that there was nothing they could do about this, and they would have to let people use the underground stations as shelters.
Images of people sleeping in the tube have entered the mythology of the war. But in fact, even at the height of the Blitz, only 4% of Londoners spent the night in the underground.
You get two versions of what it was like sheltering in an underground station. You get the kind of Cockney call Blimey Love of Duck, jolly good, drinking cups of tea, singing songs. But other people who would describe coming through in the train in the morning and describing the stench of urine, dirty blankets, grubby children, and they found it revolting.
Many more Londoners were among the 2 million households who were issued with an Anderson shelter, a corrugated steel structure which you erected yourself in the garden. Others used the cellars of their homes, or one of the 5,000 public shelters, concrete block houses at street level. For 68 nights continuously, with just one break in the autumn of 1940, the trek to the shelter was a nightly ritual for thousands of Londoners.
As the war developed, people started to make the shelters more comfortable for themselves. There were people like shelter crawlers, for example, which were travelling bands of musicians who would go along and visit a shelter and put on a little performance. People would bring along drinks, introduce some furniture, bunks, chairs, that sort of thing, and try and entertain themselves to while away the hours during an air raid.
Strange as it may seem, the vast majority of Londoners simply chose to stay in their beds during the raids.
The most noticeable point about Londoners' response to the air raids was that it was not very dramatic. They did not surge out and shake their fists at the skies and strike dramatic gestures and say, we will go on fighting until the end. Nor did they panic and hide in corners and scream. They just phlegmatically went on.
The Germans had hoped the sheer relentlessness of the attacks would terrify London into submission. But perversely, many Londoners reacted by becoming grimly determined to continue with ordinary life, turning up for work, going to the cinema, and even eating out despite the limited choice of food on offer.
The Blitz altered the perception of what London and Londoners were like. I think for people in the rest of Britain, they'd always rather thought of these kind of chirpy cockneys as a bit dodgy. They duck and dive, they're untrustworthy, they're always out for a penny. But then, suddenly, this city of untrustworthy pickpockets shows its steel, shows that it can hold out in the face of an extraordinary barrage. And it can do it with a smile on its face and a song on its lips. And you can laugh at all of that. It sounds a bit corny now, some of that stuff. But that is how it was. It's extraordinary.
On the 29th of December 1940, the Great Fire Raid devastated the commercial heart of the capital. But miraculously, St. Paul's Cathedral escaped.
If there was one building in London which symbolised the determination of a Londoner to stand fast, I think it was St. Paul's. The most dramatic of all the Blitz images is that wonderful picture of the dome of St. Paul's silhouetted against a carpet of flames.
St. Paul's survived, but the House of Commons, Westminster Abbey, the Law Courts, the Royal Mint, the medieval Guildhall, and the Tower of London were damaged, as well as 14 of Wren's priceless churches. But despite the immense damage to the city, Hitler had failed in destroying Londoners' morale. After one last huge raid on the 10th of May 1941, he turned his attention away from Britain to opening a second front against Russia. The worst was over.
Vast tracts of London had been almost wiped out. The East End and Dockland had been shattered. The great fire bombs in particular had swept away whole streets, whole areas. All over London there were huge holes where formerly fine houses had stood.
By the time the war ended in May 1945, London had taken the biggest hit. 3.5 million homes had been damaged or destroyed. Nearly 1.5 million people had been made homeless. Of the 61,000 civilians killed in Britain, half had died in London. But just as Charles II had after the Great Fire of 1666, some saw in the wreckage of the Blitz an opportunity to regenerate. And once again, history repeated itself. After the war, there wasn't the time or the money to rebuild London as a beautiful planned city. Many post-war buildings were hideous eyesores. In size, London was overtaken by Tokyo, Mexico City, and Shanghai. Britain declined as a world power, and for 40 years London declined too. Its transport system, which had once led the world, was never updated. Its great public buildings became shabby and run down. But in the 1980s, London started to fight back. The City of London once again became an international financial powerhouse, and new landmarks sprang up in the East. And in the run-up to the millennium, London's public buildings were given a new lease of life.
I remember as a child in London in the 70s
that it was a gloomy place. The river was a dead, dirty river at the heart of it. To the east were decaying docks and empty factories. But now London, which seemed to be a city whose glory days were in the past, has again regenerated itself as it has throughout its history. It's become a centre of fashion, commerce. London's partying again. It's become a place where people want to come from all over the world. And in the last 20 years, London's regenerated itself architecturally as well, so that a drab, dirty, rather dismal place is again full of new buildings, whether it's Foster's Tower Block in the city, the Millennium Bridge, Tate Modern. All of our public buildings, our river, Hungerford Bridge, have again been regenerated through forward-looking modern architecture.
Today, London is still a great world city, the largest in Western Europe. In its 2,000-year history, a muddy estuary on a small island at the edge of Europe has become a great global crossroads, a melting pot attracting people from hundreds of different cultures.
This is the one city where I think at many given points in its history, you would have felt you're at the centre of the world. Because all the world is here. Not because it's a city that lauds it. It's not the most beautiful. Many times it's an ugly old man. But it is a powerful and yet tolerant, open old man. It's an old man with open arms.
London survived fires, revolution, disease and war, and emerged from them battered but unbowed. In the words of Winston Churchill, London is like some huge prehistoric animal, capable of enduring terrible injuries, mangled and bleeding from many wounds, and yet preserving its life and movement.
Head south from the capital and you come to one of the finest moated manor houses in the country. A Time Team special follows the restoration of this medieval country pile tonight at 9 o'clock. Continue your journey through London, the greatest city, at channel4.com/history. Next, Macaulay Culkin is home alone in our Bank Holiday Monday film.
I'm wondering if you can recommend a good book, but nothing too long. I've got a very short attention span. I'm thinking about investing my money. Where should I invest? How do I make it grow? In stocks, shares, art?
There is an easier way to find information. Just press the text button on your remote control.
Oh, Richard, now I've got your attention again. What should I do with my money? Do you think I should invest? Oh, Richard, I'm sorry.
Welcome to the sleepy town of Leon the Solent.
Kill him! Kill him! Shoot him!
They're worried about asylum seekers moving to their town.
You've got fear of rape.
Is this the real voice of Britain? Keep them out. Thursday at 9 on 4.
Channel 4's international cricket coverage starts with the Empire Test Series against New Zealand on Thursday the 20th of May and continues with the West Indies tour across July and August. For further information and details on how to get tickets to watch the games live, visit channel4.com/cricket.
This is a new sauce from the makers of Liam Perrins. It's an elegant suffusion of sun-ripened tomatoes and the quintessential Worcestershire sauce that...
That makes good food great. Tomato and Worcester table sauce, new from Liam Perrins.
New Benecol yogurt drink. Just 1 pot a day is enough to lower your cholesterol. Benecol, proven to reduce cholesterol.
Now the best part of putting your makeup on is taking it all off with new Olay Daily Facials Express. Of course they deep cleanse, but what makes them special is that they provide skin-loving Olay moisture. Your skin feels not just clean, but soft and smooth. New Daily Facials Express from Olay. Love the skin you're in.
Look, I just think you guys can do better than this house, you know? Or any other house for that matter.
Look, we know you're having a hard time with this, but we love it here.
Fine, okay, if you love this house so much, then you should just live here, okay? I just hope you get used to that weird humming sound.
Joey, we know that's you.
No, it's not.
Friends, the final series, Thursday at 9 on E4 and Friday at 9 on Channel 4.
Join us on Wednesday, live at 5, for Katie Price's first in-depth interview about her sensational autobiography, Being Jordan. In it, she speaks frankly about her failed relationships with Dane and Dwight.
How an abortion and a broken heart led to a failed suicide attempt, her blossoming relationship with fellow I'm a Celebrity star Peter Andre, and of course the truth about her and David Beckham.
A couple of years ago, the salvage squad failed to get a fireboat working properly, but they have another go tonight. First on 4, this is what happens when you accidentally leave one of the kids home alone.